believe it. But that's where we are. Each of us in this room look at this crisis from a different perspective because we look at it from our own national perspectives. I'm not going to apologize for it. My judgment of what is good and bad has a very single perspective. Is it good for the United States? You have your own. That's mine. Where does all this leave my country and yours? Well, these speeches and conferences are prone to hyperbole. Maybe I'm going to engage in it, but I don't think so. The invasion of Iraq, the elimination of the Ba'ath Party, the incompetent military administration, and mostly the inability to contain Maliki has led, for the first time since Alexander or Rome, the Persian sphere of influence in the Arab heartland, a sphere of influence which profoundly changes the region, not for the moment, but perhaps into the future. So, if that is my rendition of Mel Brooks's The History of the World in 60 Minutes, where are we? And where do we go with this? The new consensus is simply that the crisis in the region is now ISIS. It must be confronted and defeated at all costs. And I am not here to counter the argument. ISIS clearly represents evil on earth. It is the return of a medieval age incredibly into the 21st century. And it should be confronted and should have no part in the history of the region or of Iraq. But is it the fundamental priority of the Western world? Well, I'll apologize again. I see priorities in what is good for my country as you see priorities in what is good for yours. If the peace is to be broken in the 21st century and destruction is to be wrought upon the things that I value, the odds of it overwhelmingly involve the Iranian regime. It is the principal threat to the international order today. Its quest for atomic weapons, its territorial ambitions, and its medieval governance. I understand that the enemy of my enemy can be my friend. I understand that. I'm from a country that aligned with the Soviet Union against the Nazis. We embrace dictators against communism. I understand. But embracing and coordinating policy with Iran for the defeat of ISIS? Really? I want ISIS destroyed. But if it means compromising for 1 minute on the Iranian nuclear program or legitimizing the mullahs, it is a price too high. ISIS needs to be defeated. But the road to ISIS's defeat is not through Tehran. It is not even profoundly a military issue. The military will be involved in the defeat of ISIS. But here's a question for your governments and mine. I want ISIS defeated. But to the leaders of Iraq, we're right behind you. Let us know when you're ready. There was a great moment in the first Bush administration when Jim Baker had been trying again and again and again to get the Israelis engaged with the Palestinians. Year after year after year, proposal after proposal, and the Israelis built more settlements and did more and more and more and more. And Baker finally said to the Israelis, "We're here. When you're ready, let us know." Here's my message to Baghdad. We want ISIS defeated. And we'll do our part militarily, our part. Let us know. Let us know when there's national reconciliation in Iraq. Let us know when profoundly all elements of Iraqi society feel safe, are involved in their own governance, have real opportunity, and a functioning government. Because when you're ready with an Iraq worth defending, we're there to help. You know how to reach us. That moment is not now. ISIS is many things. It is a threat to many things. But with all due respect, I do not feel that what is going on in Iraq with ISIS is a threat fundamentally to the survival of the United States. Iran is, and that's my priority. I also trust that coming out of the war of Iraq, we have learned some lessons. Again, it's not clear to me in our generation how many times the same lessons need to be learned, but okay, let's do it again. The West does not win asymmetrical wars. It makes good television to see air power destroying Toyota trucks with machine guns on the back. We feel like we're winning. But you are hard-pressed in the last 50 years from Vietnam forward to find where an asymmetrical war has been won by Western power. Second, it must at least be instructive that in the long history of warfare in the 20th century, no war has ever been won from the air. None. I suggested a minute ago that the war within Iraq needs to be first addressed politically. I believe that. After it is addressed politically, and we deal with the military component, absent Iranian cooperation, when we deal with it militarily, let's at least be honest with ourselves. Not only can the war not only be won without political reconciliation and inclusion within Iraq, it cannot be won without Iraqi soldiers or Arab soldiers on the ground doing the fighting. If the government in Baghdad is waiting for the American Air Force to deliver the victory, it will be a long wait, and it would be an unprecedented victory that is not realistic for either government. All of this within my country, and I suggest within yours, leads to the need for some profound thinking about how we got here, how we get out, and how this never happens again. There is nothing more frustrating in the life of any country than to continue to learn the same lessons again and again at the cost of enormous life and suffering. I have seen my country learn the same lesson in almost every decade in which I have been alive. Power is to be used only when it involves the strategic interests of our own nation. Lives are not to be expended for other purposes. Second, we can help allies, but no more than they are willing to help themselves. Third, military victories are never won by military means alone. They are won politically. And fourth, the Western world has no monopoly on the implementation of pluralist principles of governance. Every society finds their own means of assuring the legitimacy of governance and meeting the aspirations of its own people. I like ours. The British, the French, the Germans, I'm sure they like theirs. Thank God in Latvia, you have found your own. None of those have a monopoly on wisdom. It is for the great democracies to set standards that the consent of the governed is required for legitimacy. It is not for us, by military occupation or political lecturing or structuring, to decide on the form or even the complete standards. And indeed, all of our societies are in different stages of development. The Arab Spring is a tragedy for so many reasons. Such an extraordinary missed opportunity. And my country bears no more blame than any others. Our intentions were all good. Our hopes were high. But one does not go from Gaddafi to Jeffersonian democracy. There are reasons why nations develop strongmen, and I'm making no defense of them. I, like all, would like to see them replaced and expect them to meet minimalist standards. But there's a reason why some of these societies are governed the way they did. The fall of Tito and the chaos in Yugoslavia was as predictable as rain. The chaos in Iraq after the fall of Hussein was as predictable as it could be. We have lived it again and again. That is not to temper our enthusiasm for change, but it does bring a dose of reality to learn again the consequences of great nations with great ambitions being wrong. When we fail, we go home. Life goes on. Things are fine. Not for those you leave behind. The damage in Iraq is profound. It could be nearly permanent and will have enormous consequences. I love history, and I love its study. My life is about trying to understand it. The consequences of individual human decisions and how they can shape the future. I remember reading, on page 30 of the New York Times, a small 2-paragraph article about a coup in a strange city of Kabul in 1979. Take that coup through the Russian invasion, through the Mujahideen, in a straight line through September 11th, to the invasion of Iraq, to our meeting today. You drop a pebble in the ocean, and the waves and the consequences from that movement reach very distant shores. I say that only because, as people who are involved in the governance of our own lands, that we all finally accept the next time you cast a vote, as I did on that day, for which I will try to explain the rest of my life, understand how the ripples from that stone reach a distant shore, and best understand the consequences of what you do. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much, Senator, for your statement. What you said, actually, it brought me back. September 11, I used to serve in New York as ambassador with the title Ambassador of the Islamic Conference. You can see the reactions that were there. But what is a little bit shocking when I used to be invited, and I still, to have very, very prominent think tanks in Washington, very knowledgeable. But After September 11, nobody was listening to them. When in 2004, I read the book that was written by Richard Pearl and David Fromm, An End to Evil, how the Americans should act internationally and how they should divide, how they should do with France, dividing Saudi Arabia in 3 countries or whatever. It's very, very, very scary. And at that time, it seems like if they were so sure that they are going to succeed, that the Iraqi are going to throw on them flowers and it's going to work. And let me a little bit also disagree with you about the point concerning the Arab Spring. I think when it's a social movement of change, after so many frustration of these people, things take some time to correct themselves. One of the references, the international references, the French Revolution. After the French Revolution, it took 47 years of total chaos in France. Then after that, it became, hopefully, it's going to be the same in our part of the world. I will move from here to my own remarks on the current situation, but I would like to begin with an event that happened to me when I was special envoy in Iraq in 2006, when the US ambassador asked me to meet with Lee Hamilton, James Baker, Lee Hamilton committee. And they told me this is a very prominent committee of 5 prominent Republicans, 5 Democrats, independent, that myself as US ambassador had no right to attend. So we'll be sitting one side and the 10 of them. I remember the very first question I was asked, a very direct question by James Baker. He told me, Ambassador, what do you think about our policy in Iraq? My answer, I told him, before answering your question, I would like to make 2 remarks that will help you to what I'm going to say about your policy in Iraq. The first remark that originally from this part of the world, and my own generation, especially those that they got an opportunity to live in a country of institution, we fall in love with institution. But let me tell you, my generation, we were so used that you, the Americans, when you cross the Atlantic Ocean, or at that time, Western European, when they crossed the Mediterranean Sea, they were only very supportive for the most bloody regimes for their own interests. It was never and ever for our generation to develop a relation between the people, the principle of democracy, of human rights, and this is part of the reality. So when I hear now President Bush, who didn't find any weapon of mass destruction, talking about spreading democracy in Iraq, it's a joke, but unfortunately it's a joke that makes me cry, because the reality is the people that are victims now of such policy, it's a huge mess. So I don't think that you are doing the right thing. The second remark with the situation in 2006, and I used to live in the red zone with all these helicopters, the situation was very difficult. I said, I don't know, I have all the time in mind the chapter written by Winston Churchill about his relation with the Americans during the priorities of the Second World War. And he ended this chapter by this wonderful sentence in which he said, I learned only one thing, that prior to doing the right thing, they have to exhaust all other alternatives. And I'm scared it's again the same situation in Iraq. It's not working, it's not going to work. A few months after, I had to resign and to do a protesting resignation about what was happening in Iraq. The current situation, now the crisis, it has 3 levels. Definitely, you have to deal with it at the 3 levels. Of course, the Iraqi level is important, the regional one, as well as the international one. Then you have 2 characteristics when you are talking about the Iraqi themselves. The first one is the fragmentation of the society. The fragmentation, it's not only political. It took, after 2003, a social dimension in Iraq. And the second characteristic is the very high level of mistrust between Iraqis themselves. I used to talk to all of them, to all parties. You see it, I said several times to the Iraqis, you don't even make a distinction between dialogue and negotiation. Dialogue, you can dialogue with everyone. Negotiation, I understand if you would like to have a frame because you would like to know where you are going to go from here. Then, what happened with them, also the fact that I was all the time, 2006, 2007, asking myself, the American president decided to invade Iraq. But in reality, who won the war? Because what I was witnessing on the ground, more and more Iranian coming, and Al-Qaeda that didn't exist, kind of extremism. Then, of course, if you add to that sectarianism, and I was so sad because during 1 month I decided just to meet religious and ethnic leaders of Iraq. The Ambassador Bremer divided the Iraqis in Kurdish, Shia, Sunni. Objectively, these three major groups, there are some armed groups talking in their name or trying to, hijack these people. Al-Qaeda is trying to be, the Sunni, defending the Sunni. Al-Mahdi army or Badr, in the name of the Shia, and the Kurds, they have their own Peshmerga. But between them, when I received about 14 representatives of other religious groups or ethnic groups, that they have nobody to talk in their name, and how they are suffering, that pushed me. I promised them that I'm going to raise their issue internationally. This is why I did a report that I presented to some parliament on that I called Minorities in Iraq, the Other Victims. Nobody's talking about them. And even the solution that they were proposed, even in the Congress, I did it after the report of the Congress when they were asking to impose on Maliki to have 3 representatives of the Christian, 2 of the Mandaean, 1 of the Yazidite, or whatever. I said, no. We should go back to the beginning. And the constitution should be based mainly on 2 principles: citizenship and respecting pluralism. And any Iraqi has the right to be president or to be whatever. I used to give not an example from the West, but much more from India. It happened that in India, one time they had a president from a minority Muslim, and then a prime minister from a very, very small minority, a Sikh at the time, but nobody said that they are not Indian. So it was clear things are not working, are not going through. Then we had so many experiences that now are repeated, but I don't know if history is repeating itself, if it is a tragedy, tragedy then a comedy, again, about the awakening forces. Maybe at that time it was very good, to include the concerned population to fight extremism and Al-Qaeda. It went very well, but immediately after, for Maliki, these 120,000, they were not fighting Al-Qaeda. They are Sunni, and he doesn't want them to be with arms. And then what happened after. It's the same way of approaching, and I think it's much more because the international community, especially with Iraq, in the case of Iraq, they're much more reacting than acting. Okay, we become so used to what's happening in Iraq, we are not concerned. The Americans are going to go, the president himself, all what he would like to listen. How many people dead in Iraq? This is what I was told in Washington, if it's going down. Forgetting that until now, Baghdad, with a lot of cantons, the sectarian cleansing is finished, and it's still there. We have a lot of problems that nothing is said. And I totally agree with you that things should not be resolved only on the military side, but on the political side about the project. And this is my own conception, and still continuing till now, concerning Iraq. When they decided to have a constitution and election, it was decided by the Americans. The Iraqis, leaders, I used to contact them, all of them, they told me, we are not ready for that, but we don't want to miss the opportunity to have our place under the sun. I heard it from the Kurdish, from Shia, from Sunni, that accepted to participate in the election. I was in charge of holding meetings of national reconciliation. And I used to tell the Iraq, as well as the American or the Europeans, that in a way, if you consider that the train left by this constitution and this election, and you think that you are those that they were opposing by arms, the occupation, you are going to give them some positions or whatever, and they are going to join the train in a coming station, this is not going to happen. The train has to go back to the beginning to agree about a new constitution, a new Iraq. All of them, they understand that Iraq is a very rich country. It has a lot of potentials there, and if it's working very well, it can work very well. And at the same time, you see how shocked some very high level Americans, especially the vice president, when he launched the idea, maybe it's better to have the three countries in Iraq, to divide it. I was asked by some friends in Washington, I said, well, I don't know, it's a solution for one single reason. Who is going to recognize the border between them? It means a civil war that is going to continue and continue for all the time. We see the effort for national reconciliation. We had only 2 meetings in Cairo, that's how I organized, including all Iraqis, those that they accepted the political process to be part of it, and those that they were opposing, even by arms, that nothing can be done under occupation. As a beginning, it was good, but as I mentioned, very high level of mistrust, then the agendas, then when they give opportunity to the region to interfere. It's not in the hand of the Iraqis anymore. Then suddenly we had ISIS, like if it is a surprise. But about ISIS also I would like to mention something very, very current about the difference the last 2 years when I was in Syria, so how it grows. I was in Baghdad when Zarqawi was killed. And following this kind of extremism and the kind of relation that they can have and this, there's a huge difference between ISIS in Syria and ISIS in Iraq. I was witnessing in Syria that everybody was fighting ISIS, including Jabhat al-Nusra, the other branch of Al-Qaeda. Had a lot of fight, a lot of problem about their own agenda, about their own objective, the Islamic Front, all these kind of groups. While in Iraq it's totally different. People in the concerned provinces were suffering so much from Maliki and from the sectarianism in Iraq that in a way, as you mentioned, maybe the enemy of my enemy can be a friend. Anything else, even an alliance with the devil, just to end these things. And I think everybody understood this difference between Syria and Iraq, but the problem is the kind of solution that are proposed now. When I was last June in Washington, I was astonished a little bit because it happened that I arrived invited by some friends in the Middle East Institute to talk about Syria, but it happened that the same day when ISIS invaded Mosul. So in the lunch, a lot of people who had these kind of talks about what's happening there. But when you see this, as it was mentioned, that we have to give the arm to the government and the government will give them to some others. Some of the militia, and we saw it last week in Diyala when they took some villages. Some of the militia, I think personally, according to my experience there, they are at least as dangerous as ISIS in their project. And then you see this kind of alliance. Where are we going? Where are we going? Are we going to postpone some kind of problems? No. Should we go to an international conference about Iraq? Of course, those that are in power now, they would say, no, we have the constitution, everyone put the article the way he would like, we have 140, and then the agendas, because they don't trust each other. See the Kurds, how they are dealing. Even the way, I know that the US administration didn't want to give them some heavy weapons, because they're trying to have their own army. Last April, we were attending some meetings organized by the Friends of the Middle East Institute at that time with the Carnegie concerning the area. Every 2-3 months they used to organize in a different capital of the Middle East an event on Libya, Iraq, and I was invited to talk a little bit about Syria, and it was in Erbil. I was so surprised when President Barjani in his statement said, if Maliki is going to stay in power, I'm going to ask the Kurdish people for a referendum of independence. It's shocked, What would be the reaction of the international community? And anyway, you did everything to have Maliki in power. And they said, I recognize we made a mistake, but we are not going to repeat the same mistake. So I hope with these opportunities, with this kind of exchange, that will help to put things the right way. And how to resolve the problem, not only addressing only Daesh. Daesh, yes, it's very dangerous, but it's a consequence of such situation. So we have to address the whole situation. And again, when you hear from people, this is very sad. The Americans decided to make the war, but Iran and Al-Qaeda won the war there. What kind of solution? According to the current situation, I don't know. Still to explore a lot of things. Take in consideration the kind of fragmentation that the Iraqi knows. You have to talk to everybody, to all kinds of Iraqis. One of the problems I mentioned several times, when I used to be representing the UN in Syria, once we decided to have a Geneva conference, I used to receive a lot of Syrian all of them, they would like to visit, hundreds of parties. I know that these parties, they have a maximum 10 people in the party. But it's amazing, all of them claiming when they came, we are representing 70% of the Syrian people, and we decided to attend Geneva, this is our list. That I told them one day, I have a mathematical problem. Everybody is claiming representing 70% of Syrian. How many 70 you have in 100 here in Syria? This is part of the reality. I think it's not easy, it's very, very complicated, but it has to be addressed, and I don't think at all that the Iraqi can do it alone. They have to be helped internationally, as well if it is possible regionally. Thank you very much. Thank you. Now, our third speaker for this session is Dr. Stephen O'Brien, editor of the London Magazine, leader of the literary section of the Critics' Council of Great Britain, novelist, journalist, and a poet. We need a lot of poems in Iraq. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you for that introduction, and you'll forgive me if I have some recourse to some poets. I've been asked to speak on why we're here, or maybe why Latvia, but I'll begin with a word, bewildered, that I used in a speech I gave last year in the House of Parliament in London. I began with the word bewildered, and Ted Hughes, one of Britain's greatest post-war poets and literary figures, said that every word contains a spirit, and it's the spirit of the word, its active power. And if we look into the word bewildered, bewilder means to be led into a wild place. So we've been led into a wild place. The international community has been led into a wild place. The EU is bewildered. Everyone is bewildered. Iraq has been bewildered, has been led into a wild place. So I suppose then, if we consider Latvia's potential role in helping to lead us back to safety or out of the wild place, maybe a restoration of balance, it is Latvia's potential for helping to achieve a just and peaceful settlement in Iraq. I wonder if we could think about why Latvia has any interest in this. Well, there are synergies of history and experience. Latvia was long an occupied nation and fought hard for its liberty and its right for self-determination. It was at the mercy of greater powers. I would suggest that Latvia recognizes the plight of those in other countries who suffer from tyranny and occupation and the aftermath of such cataclysms. In assuming the presidency of the EU, Latvia is poised to give a proud utterance of its own sense of independence. And it may not be as big as other EU countries, the constituent countries, but it has an equal voice. And unlike some of the other EU countries, Latvia has no ulterior motives or sense of past when it comes to participate in the helping restore Iraq to some sense of stability. In practical terms, obviously, there are a sense of investment and agricultural ventures. But Latvia can be an honest broker between the riven and sundered sections of Iraqi society. It can lend the wisdom gained by having gone through a process of reconciliation and settlement. And you'll also forgive me if I recourse to my own country. Although I speak with a very English accent, I was born in Ireland, and hence I'm wearing this ridiculous suit, which is an Irish tweed suit, which has stand up to anything. My father said it's bulletproof. I can go anywhere with this suit. It stands up on its own without me in it. Anyway, just as in Ireland, where there's been a long process whereby at the end war-hardened men can sit together in the spirit of mutual trust. A friend of mine, a colleague and a friend, who has interviewed many of the paramilitaries, the ex-paramilitaries in Ireland, was often confounded when he was talking particularly to former IRA members who always spoke about the continuing process. And he asked me, why do they keep speaking about the continuing process when we have a settlement? And I said, well, firstly, it's a Catholic thing, and Catholics think in terms of centuries rather than years. But also that the process is, it needs to be continually affirmed. It's not just an end, it is a continually affirmed thing. And I think probably Latvians would understand what I'm saying. Here's a recourse to the poet then. A great Irish poet, Yeats, said of himself, little room, great hatred. He said, I have a fanatic heart. Well, this was said in the Irish Civil War of 1922, when brother fought against brother, and terrible atrocities were committed. Indeed, far greater atrocities were committed in the short Civil War in 1922 than had been committed by the British against the Irish 2 or 3 years before. And Seamus Heaney, another great Irish poet, said, he wrote about the intimate and proximate killings. And these resonate in an Iraqi context as well. For Yeats, it was only by recognizing the fanatic in himself, in everybody, in all of ourselves, we can understand it in others and progress towards some reconciliation. Yet Latvia, with its history and its EU role, can be a significant party in trying to bring enemies in Iraq into dialogue and furtherance. One must ask then also, what do the EU partners, the EU nations as a whole, how do they understand Iraq? Well, bewildered is the other word, I suppose. Seamus Heaney said, he died 2 years ago, a great Irish poet said, of the post-9/11 world, he said, we have entered a mythic time. Now, I would say there have been other mythic times in different places, but they usually come at the equinoxes of faith and injustice. Indeed, all nations tell themselves their own myths. The Battle of Britain, the storming of the Bastille. The danger is when the myths obscure the reality, or almost if they take on a sacred nature, the myth itself becomes the reality. Heaney went on to say, acts of coldly premeditated terror and the campaign in Iraq, these things have the quality of mirage about them. We experience them as a matter of course, partly as the undeniable facts of day-to-day life, but partly also as some kind of ominous foreboding, as if we were walking into an immense theater of bad dreams. So I would say that we've been walking into this nightmarish theater for far too long, and to quote Yeats again, the blood-dimmed tide has been loosed. My stepdaughters are only 21 years old, and if they'd been born in Iraq, they would know nothing but war. This so-called liberation of Iraq, bombing and invasion and the fostering of sectarianism, in my opinion, has brought nothing but chaos and blood. It seems that the EU and the USA are now gripped in a fist of paralysis. The paralysis is fired, I believe, by a mixture of shame, myth, and ignorance. Patently, Iraq was left by the US-led coalition as not a viable state. It was broken, it wasn't fixed. The US maybe appears to have turned its back on its recent past. No, I think it has. And the EU is caught too often in the headlights, many voices in discordant inaction. So Latvia is hopefully not a party to this collective paralysis of myth and shame and ignorance, and so can act as an iconoclast in this respect. The outgoing chief of the defense staff in Britain said on the radio on Sunday morning, yesterday, things didn't end conveniently in Iraq. That's a typically English understatement, I think. By promoting dialogue and using its influence as a respected EU member, with its history of suffering as well, Latvia can play a significant part in helping to cut through this bewilderment.
Okay, thank you very much. We still have 12 minutes, to give the opportunity to audience if there are any questions or remarks. Please. Please identify yourself and to whom your question is addressed.
My name is Sufyan Samar. I'm a TV presenter and journalist from Iraq. I'm going to address this in Arabic for a member of Congress and London Magazine. سوف أتكلم باللغة العربية أولاً. شكراً.
Thank you.
المشاكل الموجودة الآن ليست فقط بتواجد ISIS.
They are not related to
لدينا
the
مشكلة
presence
أكبر
of
من
ISIS in the
في
area.
العراق الآن.
But we've got
ألا وهي
ISIS in Iraq.
وهي
But it's not ISIS, it's ISIS. The Iranian, Britain,
in Syria, in Iraq
in
and Syria.
Syria, their presence in there.
هؤلاء تم
All these
التصريح لهم من قبل حكومة حيدر العبادي الذي يدعي أنه جاء بالإصلاحات ولكن خول لهم أن تكون قوة تحت إدارة الحكومة العراقية ولم يضعها تحت قائمة الإرهاب كما ادعى في البداية أنه ضد أي نوع من الإرهاب سواء كان سنيا أم شيعيا. الانطباع السائد الآن لدى المجتمع العراقي وأغلبية الشعب العراقي أن الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية أعطت الضوء الأخضر لمثل هكذا حكومة لإعطاء الضوء الأخضر لمثل هكذا ميليشيات لقتل المناطق السنية بحجة ضرب داعش. ما هي الخطوات العملية التي يمكن أن يقوم بها أعضاء الكونغرس الأمريكي أن يضعوا هذه الميليشيات الإرهابية الشيعية في قائمة الإرهاب فورا وبدون أي خطوة تراجع أو أي خطوة تردد. المشكلة الآن التي يعاني منها المجتمع أنه هناك ازدواجية في النظر لمسألة الإرهاب. كما قال السيد lamani أن مسألة الإرهاب هي محصلة ما يحدث في المناطق السنية من تواجد داعش هي ليست حاضنة. لا يمكن إقناع المجتمع العراقي أن عملية انسحاب الجيش العراقي أمام 500 مقاتل فقط في يوم وليلة وبتسليم السلاح لهم من قبل الحكومة لم يتم عن قصد. كيف يمكن أيضا للعشائر السنية محاربة داعش أو آيسيس بدون أن تمتلك سلاح وعملية تقرير الحرس الوطني تم إلغائها من قبل حيدر العبادي بينما عملية رسمنة أو جعل الميليشيات الشيعية رسمية حدثت خلال 72 ساعة. ما هي الخطوات اللي يمكن أن يبذلها الاتحاد الأوروبي والجهود التي يمكن أن يبذلها الجميع من أجل وضع هذه الميليشيات وهي أكثر من 2-3
شكرا. أنا في عدة أسئلة هون.
Well, a politician is never happier than when he's quoting himself, so I'll begin by, I tried to note that I believe the fight against ISIS begins in Baghdad, and it is primarily, not exclusively, but primarily, at least initially, an Iraqi responsibility. I agree with most of what you said. The militias are themselves an agent of the Iranians. A terrorist regime. So we're fighting ISIS with terrorists and arming them. And not only does it not make sense, it isn't going to work. I share your premise. If there's going to be a fight against ISIS, it comes after some reconciliation in Baghdad. You cannot defend a state until you form a state. There is no functioning pluralist Iraqi state. That is a preliminary step. This campaign against ISIS is long-term. There is time, precious little, but there is time to build an Iraqi state worth defending, one that actually can include all elements. But to give weapons at the moment to this government, only to have them either give them to terrorist militias run by the Iranians or surrender them to ISIS makes no sense.
I prefer also to speak in Arabic because I can explain my idea in Arabic better.
أفضل أن أتحدث باللغة. Sorry, I prefer to speak in English.
أكمل كلام
I'd like just to carry on to continue what was stated by Sufyan.
وركز على أن
And I'd like to highlight that is the
مع الأسف
catastrophe.
أكثر عمقا من ذلك.
It is much deeper.
ولذا أريد
That's why
إلقاء الضوء
I'd
على
like to
هذا
highlight,
الجانب
shed the
اللي أشير
light on the Shia's militias.
يقال أن هناك
It is
استراتيجية
that there is a
الإدارة الأمريكية
strategy
الحالية
in the current American administration
أن المشكلة
that
الرئيسية
is
أو
the
الخطر
main problem or the
الكبير
main risk or
هو
threat
السنة
are
المتطرفين.
the Sunnis, the extremist
لذلك
Sunnis.
يجب
That's
التركيز
why
على
we should
الشيعة
concentrate
ولو
and
كانوا
focus on the Shias, even if
إرهابيين
they are
ولو
terrorists,
كانوا مدرجين في قائمة
even if they are
الإرهاب. لأننا نعرف
enlisted on the
مثلاً
terrorist lists.
أن
Because, for example, we know that is the leaders
الميليشيات
of the militias
التي تعمل في العراق
which is working in Iraq,
الأرض فسادا
and they are
كما
spreading the
أشرت
killing.
إليه أخ مختار.
As Mokhtar mentioned, part of it,
هؤلاء هم قادتهم
they are
مدرجين
led
في القوائم
by
الإرهابية.
people who they are listed in the terrorist, like Al-Muhandis, the engineer,
رئيس هيئة الأركان
who is
المشتركة
the
للجيش
chief of
العراقي
staff of the current of the Iraqi army. That is what actually that is the use this terminology. And even Hadi al-Amiri, he himself who kissed the hand of Khamenei before the TV. This is the guy, this is the man who is leading the war in Iraq. Qasem Soleimani as well, he's the head. The question, please, is that this is the strategy or the strategy or this is an problem for the American whom actually they have surrendered just to find an exit. Also, I'd like just to mention the question which actually you raised by Mokhtar, which you said that is what's the solution. If that is the Iranian Wilayat al-Faqih, that is, do I have to concentrate on this or on something else?
Well, it won't surprise you that I agree with most of that analysis. Were I an Iraqi looking at the twin problems of ISIS and the Shia militia, while both are crises for reestablishing a viable Iraqi state, it is going to be far harder in the long term to get the Iranian regime out of Iraq than it is getting ISIS out. ISIS may in time be defeated, it may evolve, many things may happen for it. Getting Iran, after all this time, out of its dominant position with the Shia militia is going to be far harder, and my judgment, therefore, deserves to be at least as much of a priority. You know, I would accept the challenge that this is that you laid out for the United States, but this is not primarily an American problem. And we all need to get past thinking that every problem has an American solution. This is an Iraqi problem. If among the many miscalculations that I personally feel as someone who is a small participant in these events in recent years, I never would have believed that the Iraqi sense of national identity would have so easily succumbed to sectarian identity, or that Iranian influence wouldn't have aroused more Iraqi nationalism. It does not appear to have. But if the nation is to be saved, it must. That's the first thing to look for in solving this crisis, my opinion.
Thank you very much. Let me thank our speakers for their presentation as well as their answers. I think I've been told that time is over. Now we will have 1 hour for lunch, and we have to come back at 1:30 to have our third session about mainly ISIS in Iraq. Thank you very much.